All right, let's dive deep into something that might sound, well, a little dry at first. Campaign finance.
You might be thinking, what's so exciting about dollar signs?
But trust me, this isn't just about numbers.
It's about power
influence.
and how our democracy actually works behind the scenes.
And we're talking especially about the 2024 election, which is, shaping up to be the most expensive one ever.
And it's not just who wins the White House. The impact of campaign finance goes way beyond that.
We've actually got a whole bunch of different sources here to help us break it down. An explainer article to give us the big picture, some in-depth academic research, even official guidelines from the FEC. We're going to use all of this to follow the money trail, so to speak.
Exactly.
Uncover those surprising facts, the stuff they don't always tell you.
Cut through all that jargon.
And hopefully you'll come away from this understanding how campaign cash can actually translate into the decisions that affect all of us.
Like real-world decisions.
Yeah, the stuff that makes a difference in our lives.
Absolutely. So to understand where we are today, we need to go back in time a bit. To a time, believe it or not, when things weren't quite so crazy.
Back in the day, huh?
Back in the 1970s.
Okay.
People were really worried about these secret campaign contributions. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
So they passed the Federal Election Campaign Act, or FECA for short.
FECA.
The aim was to make things more transparent, shine a light on where the money was coming from. But, well, things have gotten a lot more complex since the 70s, that's for sure.
I think it's safe to say that. And speaking of things getting more complex, we can't talk about campaign finance without talking about this. The Supreme Court's Citizens United ruling back in 2010. It feels like this is a ruling that everyone always talks about, but honestly, what did it actually do?
Right to the heart of it.
Yeah.
Well, Citizens United basically said that corporations and unions, they have the same free speech rights as individuals.
Okay.
Which means they can spend unlimited amounts of money to support or oppose candidates.
So no limits?
Pretty much. Now, whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, that's a whole other debate.
It's a big debate.
Some argue it protects free speech.
Yeah.
Corporations have a voice too. Others say it gives corporations way too much power, especially in politics.
It's hard to argue that it hasn't had a massive impact on how much money we're talking about in elections. I mean, our sources point out that spending in federal elections has more than doubled since that Citizens United ruling.
It's mind-boggling.
We hit a record, get this, $14.4 billion in 2020. With those kinds of numbers, it's hard not to wonder, does the average person, the average voter, even have a chance?
It's a valid question.
Yeah.
And here's something else to consider. It's not just the total amount that's gone up, right? The average size of those individual donations, the ones from regular people, those have increased a lot too in the past decade.
So it's costing more just to get in the game to have some kind of influence?
Potentially, yes. It's a trend worth noting.
Okay, so let's talk about the big players, the people and groups who are really driving this whole campaign finance machine. We hear all these terms thrown around: individuals, peace, super PACs. What's the difference? Can you break it down for us?
You're right, it can be confusing. So PACs, or political action committees, they've been around for a while. They can contribute directly to candidates.
Straight to the campaign.
But there are limits on how much they can give.
Right.
Super PACs, on the other hand, those can raise and spend unlimited amounts. No limits. But they're not allowed to coordinate directly with the campaigns they're supporting.
So it's like a loophole.
Some would call it that. They often run their own ads, do their own thing to support a candidate indirectly.
Interesting. And what about the motivations behind all this money? I mean, is it all just about which party wins, or is there something more to it?
It's definitely more nuanced than that. It's often about advancing specific policies, gaining access to decision makers. It's not always just red versus blue.
I see. So these donors have specific agendas they're trying to push.
Often, yes. And our research really suggests that they're very strategic about it. They want to influence legislation, shape the political landscape in a way that aligns with their interests, whatever those might be.
It reminds me of that whole donor to ambassador pipeline thing we read about.
Exactly. That's a prime example of how this works. Big donors, regardless of, their qualifications, they get appointed to these cushy ambassador posts.
Just because they donated a bunch of money.
It happens more than you might think. It's a way that campaign contributions can turn into real-world perks.
Wow. Okay, let's put some names to these mega donors. One name that keeps popping up in our research, George Soros.
Right, Soros. He's a major Democratic donor. He poured millions, and I mean millions, into progressive causes. Just recently, he gave $15 million to Future Forward, a Democratic super PAC. That gives you a sense of the scale we're talking about here.
So on the other side, the Republican side, we've got the eye lines. This billionaire couple, they've been huge backers of the Republican Party's shift to the right. We're talking almost $200 million spent on political campaigns.
And their funding, it's helped elect candidates who are pushing, well, what some call a more combative, hard right brand of conservatism.
So you've got these incredibly wealthy individuals on both sides shaping the political landscape. I mean, it makes you wonder, with so much money concentrated like this, does the average person, the regular voter, even have a voice anymore?
It's the million-dollar question, literally. And it's one we're going to keep exploring as we go deeper into this world of campaign finance. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at the 2024 money race specifically.
Okay, so zoom in on this election. What's happening?
Well, both Biden and Trump, unsurprisingly, they're attracting massive amounts of funding, but they're going about it in very different ways.
How so?
Biden's latest fundraising numbers, they're impressive. Over $97 million in just the last quarter. That's a serious war chest to work with.
That's a lot of money.
It is. But Trump, well, he's turned his legal troubles into a fundraising goldmine. He's selling merchandise with his mugshot on it. Oh, yeah. And every time he's in court, his campaign sends out fundraising appeals. It's unconventional, but it seems to be working for him.
It's definitely a strategy. But there is something kind of hopeful in all of this. Our research showed that grassroots donations, especially for Biden, they're way up. Could this be a sign that things are shifting? That small donors might actually start to counterbalance the influence of these mega donors?
It's an interesting trend, something to keep an eye on for sure. But remember, we're still talking about billions of dollars being poured into this election. And a lot of it is going to be focused on those key battleground states. So money could still very well decide who wins in 2024.
And that brings us to the question of reform. Are there any actual efforts to bring more transparency and accountability to this whole system?
Well, there have been attempts. One big one is the Disclose Act. The goal is to shine a light on dark money.
And for anyone who's not familiar, dark money is basically political spending where the source of the funds is hidden, which means wealthy individuals, corporations, they can have this huge influence without anyone knowing who they are.
Exactly. It's a big problem. And it's no surprise that Republicans, who often benefit from this dark money, they've repeatedly blocked the Disclose Act. It really goes to show who benefits from the current system and who wants to change it.
Speaking of hidden influences, our sources also talk about foreign interference in U.S. elections and how campaign finance can play a role in that.
That's a whole other can of worms. It's a complex issue.
Our sources pointed to allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 election, claims that money was funneled to the NRA, and maybe even to Trump's campaign. Now, we have to be very clear here. These are very serious allegations, but they are highly contested, and there's been no definitive proof.
That's an important point. But the possibility, the potential for foreign influence through campaign finance, that's real. It's something that both lawmakers and regular citizens are more and more concerned about. We're actually going to dig into this in more detail later on in our deep dive.
So we've covered a lot already. We've seen how campaign finance has evolved over time, who those big players are, and how they're using their money to try to shape the political landscape. But this is really just the beginning.
We're just getting started.
So we've seen just how much money is flowing into these elections, but I think it's time to go beyond just the numbers.
Yeah.
We need to understand what this influence actually looks like in action. What are the real-world consequences?
Absolutely. We have to look at how this influx of cash, especially from those mega donors we talked about, how does that actually shape policy? How does it potentially even shift the whole political landscape?
One of the things that really struck me in our research was that it's not always a simple quid pro quo, right? It's not just, I give you money, you vote this way. It seems like donor motivations are a lot more complex than that.
You're right. It's not always that straightforward. Well, sure, some donors might be looking for those specific favors, a vote on a particular bill or something. But many of them, they're driven by much broader ideological goals.
So they're playing the long game.
Exactly. They're trying to influence the whole direction of the political system. And with the rise of super PACs, they have even more tools to do that.
I mean, it's crazy. Our Explainer article mentioned that super PACs spent almost $1 billion in the 2022 midterms alone. That's a huge jump from just a few years ago.
It's an incredible amount of money. And this shift towards super PACs, it has really huge implications for transparency and accountability.
Because they can accept unlimited donations.
Right. It becomes much harder to track where the money is really coming from, who's actually behind it all, who's pulling the strings, so to speak.
It's like this whole shadowy network of influence operating behind the scenes.
And it's not just super PACs either. Our sources also highlighted the role of dark money in all of this.
Where the source of the funding is hidden intentionally.
Remember the Disclose Act we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
It was specifically designed to try to address this problem, but it's faced so much opposition from those who benefit from this lack of transparency.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're benefiting from a system, you don't really want to change it, right? But let's shift gears a bit here. I want to talk about another layer of complexity, and that's foreign money in U.S. election.
Yeah, this is where things get really tricky. Our sources point to allegations of Russian interference in the 2016 election. There are claims that money was funneled to the NRA, potentially even to Trump's campaign. But we have to emphasize these are very serious allegations, but they are highly contested.
And there's no definitive proof.
Right. It's a very sensitive topic, and it's important to approach it with caution. But the potential for foreign influence, it's undeniable, and raises the question, how do you regulate money flowing across borders in a globalized world like ours?
That's a good question.
It's like trying to catch smoke.
Yeah.
But our research did suggest some potential solutions. One idea is to update those campaign finance laws to take into account the digital age where money can move so quickly across borders.
Makes sense.
Another idea is to just mandate the disclosure of donors for all political spending, period. No more hiding. Get rid of those dark money groups.
That sounds like a good idea, but is there the political will to actually do that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, right? Unfortunately, those who make the laws, they often rely on those same donors who they'd be regulating.
So it's a conflict of interest.
It's a catch-22, and a very frustrating one.
So it can feel overwhelming. Like, what can regular people even do about this? Should we just throw up our hands and say the system is rigged?
Definitely not. Actually, now more than ever, it's crucial for citizens to be informed and engaged. We have to demand transparency, demand accountability from our elected officials.
So it starts with awareness.
Absolutely. We have to keep having these national conversations about campaign finance reform, bring those issues into the light. But it can't stop there. We need to push for actual change.
Okay, so then what? How do we move from awareness to action?
We have to hold those officials accountable, right?
Yeah.
Support candidates who make campaign finance reform a priority, and advocate for policies that actually limit the influence of money in politics.
Our research mentions several organizations that are already doing great work on this front.
Absolutely. Groups like Open Secrets, the Campaign Legal Center, the Brennan Center for Justice, they're doing crucial research, providing analysis, advocating for those changes.
They're shining a light on all the stuff that's happening in the shadows.
Exactly. They're real champions for democracy, and they need our support.
So we can't just sit back and hope someone else fixes this.
Right. And it doesn't have to be huge, sweeping changes right away. Even small actions can make a difference. You can donate to those organizations, volunteer your time, just spread the word about their work. Every bit helps.
Okay, so as we get ready to wrap up our deep dive here, I want to leave you with a question to think about. It's a big one. If we could redesign the system from scratch, how would we ensure that elections are actually about the voices of the people, not just the size of their wallets?
Wow. That's a powerful question. It's a challenge that demands a lot of creativity, some really innovative thinking, and a deep commitment to those ideals of a fair and representative democracy.
It's a challenge we have to rise to meet. I mean, if we want to safeguard the future of our democracy, we have to figure this out.
It's true.
All right, so we've gone deep, really deep into the world of campaign finance. We've seen how it works, its impact on our political system. We've talked about the unsettling truths, but also some reasons for hope.
Yeah.
And I think the key takeaway here is that knowledge is power.
Right.
By understanding how this money trail works, we become more informed citizens. And then we're better equipped to participate in the democratic process, to advocate for a more just and equitable future. Thanks for going on this journey with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all of you listening, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. All right, so we've made it to the final stretch of our deep dive into campaign finance. We've gone from like the history of it all the way to these super PACs and this whole dark money thing. And now I think it's time to face the big question, the one that's been looming over this whole conversation. Does this system, the one we have right now, does it actually represent the will of the people?
That's the core of it, right? When so much power, so much influence is in the hands of, well, a pretty small group of wealthy donors and these special interests, it's easy to feel like, I don't know, like your voice, like the average person's voice just gets lost in the noise.
And our research really backs that up. Like those academic excerpts we looked at, they made a pretty strong argument that this outsized role of money, it can really distort the way policy is made, and it can make it so much harder for regular citizens to have a real say in things.
It creates a system where, honestly, politicians are more accountable to their donors than they are to the people they're supposed to represent. And that undermines the whole idea of a healthy democracy, doesn't it?
So the question is, what can we do about it? It's easy to get overwhelmed, to feel like the system is rigged and just give up. But what are the actions, the things people can actually do that can make a difference?
I get that feeling, that sense of hopelessness. But giving up, that's not the answer. I really think the first step is awareness, which is what we're trying to do here. We need to keep talking about this, keep having those conversations about campaign finance reform, and bring it all out into the open.
So awareness is the starting point, but then what? How do we translate that into actual change?
We have to demand better from our elected officials. It sounds simple, but it's true. Hold them accountable. Support candidates who are serious about campaign finance reform, and push for policies, real concrete policies that limit how much influence money can have in politics.
I know our sources mentioned a few organizations that are doing really important work on this front.
Oh, absolutely. Groups like Open Secrets, the Campaign Legal Center, the Brennan Center for Justice, they're doing amazing work. Research, analysis, advocacy. They're shining a light on all those hidden corners of our political system and pushing for real reform.
They sound like they're really fighting the good fight.
They are, and they rely on the support of informed citizens, people like you, who care about this issue.
So even if we can't single-handedly change the whole system, there are things we can do to support the movement for reform.
Exactly. And, it doesn't have to be this huge, grand gesture. Even small actions can make a difference. Donating to those organizations, volunteering your time, even just talking about this issue with your friends and family, spreading the word, all of that adds up.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, this exploration of campaign finance, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. And it's a big one. If we could start over, if we could rebuild this whole system from scratch, how would we do it? How would we make sure that elections are truly about the people, about their voices, and not just about who has the most money?
It's a question worth thinking about. It's a challenge that requires us to be creative, to come up with new solutions, and to be truly committed to the ideals of a fair and representative democracy.
It's a challenge, but I think it's one we have to face head on. For the sake of our democracy, for the sake of our future, we've gone deep into the world of campaign finance, explored how it works, and talked about its impact on our political system. We've seen some pretty unsettling stuff, for sure, but we've also seen reasons for hope, and I think that's the important thing to remember. We've learned a lot, and that knowledge, that's powerful. By understanding how this money trail works, we become more informed citizens. We can participate in the process, and we can advocate for a future where money doesn't have this outsized influence on our politics. So thanks for joining us on this journey, for taking the time to learn about this crucial issue, and keep those conversations going.
Thank you.
And to everyone listening, thanks for being here for this deep dive.